happens when a holiday meant for fireworks and celebration turns into the night? America realizes a new domestic battlefield has opened inside its own borders. On July 4th, beneath the glow of exploding colors, a different kind of flash tore through the Prairieland ICE Detention Center in North Texas. Not the brilliance of celebration, but the muzzle flare of rifles. A coordinated ambush, officers scrambling for cover, a police lieutenant collapsing with a bullet wound to the neck, and a country forced to confront the question, has America's internal conflict entered a new phase? The attack unfolded at 10:37 p.m. Investigators later confirmed it was not a protest gone wrong, but a pre-planned assault carried out by what federal authorities describe as a North Texas Antifa cell, a group that, according to prosecutors, mirrors the structure of militant networks seen in Europe and in rare cases resembles the decentralized models used by insurgent movements abroad. Fireworks were launched at the facility to draw unarmed correctional officers outside. The moment police arrived, shots erupted from concealment. The ambush lasted seconds, but its consequences now stretch across the nation. Federal agents quickly descended. Over 200 FBI personnel were assigned an extraordinary deployment for a single non-fatal shooting. Investigators seized rifles, body armor, encrypted devices, and began tracing the movement of suspects across multiple Texas cities, Dallas, Fort Worth, Grand Prairie, and beyond. Early evidence revealed encrypted chats, coordinated roles, and a clear intent to target law enforcement. Phrases such as "blue lives don't matter" circulated in digital channels. One attacker allegedly manufactured AR platform rifles for the group. Another, according to court records, traveled repeatedly to gatherings of armed activist clubs. By dawn, the scale became clear. 20 arrests, multiple safe houses, and hints of communication threads stretching into Oregon, California, and other regions historically associated with militant anti-government activism. Under President Donald Trump, the FBI began treating the incident under domestic terrorism authorities, enabling financial tracking, expanded surveillance, and cross-state operations. Legal scholars noted that these tools were once reserved for fighting Al-Qaeda or ISIS. Now they were being applied to a domestic political movement. The event triggered a deeper strategic evaluation. How does a nation distinguish between constitutionally protected dissent and organized violence? Where is the line between activism and terrorism? Analysts from Reuters, BBC, and The Guardian highlighted a critical tension. The United States must protect civil liberties without allowing militant factions left or right to exploit those freedoms. Meanwhile, outlets like DW and Al Jazeera noted that America's global rivals would watch closely. An internal fracture of this magnitude could weaken U.S. diplomatic leverage, military focus, and perceived stability abroad. But the human impact is immediate and raw. A police lieutenant nearly died. Families living near the detention center awoke to armored vehicles rolling down quiet streets. Teachers, students, and ordinary residents found their names suddenly linked to a national terrorism case. And communities across Texas now face the painful reality that the next flash of fireworks could mask the sound of gunfire. If one cell could carry out a coordinated attack on July 4th, what happens when others believe they can do the same? And who pays the price if the line between protest and warfare continues to blur? The Prairieland attack forced investigators to look backward toward the long, winding path that built the modern American Antifa networks, now under federal scrutiny. How did a movement that once confronted neo-Nazis at Punk shows transform into what prosecutors describe as a loosely connected militant enterprise? And how did decades of confrontations, clashes, and shifting political winds set the stage for a coordinated armed operation in Texas? The roots stretch to the late 1980s. In Minneapolis, small anti-racist crews like the Baldies confronted violent skinhead groups attempting to recruit at concerts and street corners. These early formations were raw, improvised, and hyper-local. Their message was simple: if extremist groups marched, they would physically push back. Reuters and BBC archives from the period show a rise in community-organized street defense groups, many reacting to racial violence when municipal authorities failed to intervene. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, similar anti-fascist networks began spreading through major U.S. cities. Portland, Oregon, now infamous for its political clashes, became a defining hub. Groups such as Rose City Antifa adopted European-style red and black symbolism while building a reputation for direct confrontation. DW Analysis later described Portland as the testing ground where U.S. anti-fascist culture collided with the expanding digital era, a place where online organization and street activism fused into something new. Two major political waves escalated the movement further. First, the 2016 presidential election, which ignited nationwide ideological polarization. Then the 2020 George Floyd protests, during which loosely affiliated Antifa groups mobilized across dozens of cities, sometimes clashing with law enforcement, sometimes merging with broader left-wing demonstrations. The Guardian reported that by 2020, Antifa had shifted from a niche subculture to a national symbol admired by some, feared by others, misunderstood by most. But the transformation into a more militant structure accelerated after 2021. Encrypted communication apps proliferated. Small autonomous groups adopted tactics borrowed from foreign anti-authoritarian movements, flash mobs, rapid dispersals, and logistics sharing. Defense analysts cited by Janes observed that some cells began stockpiling gear typically associated with paramilitary groups, radios, body armor, improvised shields, and in rare cases, firearms. That evolution is what prosecutors highlighted when describing the North Texas cell implicated in the Prairie Land attack. Though decentralized and lacking formal hierarchy, investigators argue that these groups share ideology, tactics, and cross-state relationships. Al Jazeera noted that Antifa functions not as one organization, but as a constellation of microgroups that can activate quickly and with little trace. It is this decentralized nature that makes law enforcement's task extraordinarily complex. The American political climate further inflamed the situation. As President Donald Trump expanded federal authorities to target domestic terrorism, far-left groups increasingly framed themselves as resistors to state repression, reinforcing a cycle in which each side perceived the other as escalating the conflict. The balance between public safety and civil liberties grew more volatile with each passing year. For decades, anti-fascist activism operated in the shadows of subculture and protest. Now, with armed cells alleged to be carrying out coordinated attacks, the country faces a deeper question. What happens when a movement built to fight extremism becomes the subject of terrorism investigations itself? The night of July 4th revealed not just an attack, but an operation planned, coordinated, and executed with precision that shocked even veteran investigators. What unfolded outside the Prairie Land ICE Detention Center was not a chaotic protest spiraling out of control. It was the culmination of days of encrypted communication, tactical preparation, and deliberate intent. The deeper federal agents dug, the more the structure resembled a small coordinated cell, not an improvised street group. Court filings describe approximately 12 individuals, all dressed in black, equipped with military-style clothing, gloves, masks, radios, and high-powered flashlights. Gear investigators say reflects planning rather than spontaneity. Security footage captured them moving in formation. Some carried long guns, others held radios relaying positions across the facility's perimeter. Two members broke off to vandalize vehicles with spray-painted slogans meant to inflame emotion and draw officers outside. Every action served a purpose: disruption, distraction, exposure. The attack began with fireworks, loud, disorienting, and aimed directly at windows and guard structures. According to FBI analysis, this was a lure tactic designed to force unarmed correctional staff into vulnerable positions. At 10:59 p.m., Alvarado Police Lieutenant Thomas Gross arrived in response to the escalating commotion. Seconds later, a gunman positioned behind cover opened fire, striking him in the neck. The timing was exact. The ambush was deliberate. Weapons recovered later paint an even clearer picture. Federal agents identified multiple AR platform rifles built by Cameron Arnold, one of the indicted suspects. According to prosecutors, Arnold had manufactured these weapons himself and distributed them within the cell, an action that echoes logistical practices seen in decentralized militant movements overseas. Jane's defense analyst noted that such internal supply chains, however rudimentary, significantly elevate a group's operational capability. Encrypted messaging logs revealed the attackers coordinating routes, roles, and fallback points. Members expressed frustration with peaceful demonstrations, echoing sentiments often associated with radicalization pathways. Phrases like, "I'm done with peaceful protests" and "blue lives don't matter" surfaced, underscoring the ideological shift noted by federal experts. Al Jazeera's reporting emphasized that these conversations show a transition from protest culture to something more confrontational and far more dangerous. Investigators determined that several suspects traveled from cities hours away, converging on Alvarado only for the operation. This indicated organization across a physical and digital network. One suspect, described in court records as a Dallas area schoolteacher, had prior arrests linked to left-wing protest groups. Another had ties to an armed activist club known as the John Brown Gun Club, which has been under scrutiny in multiple states. Reuters reported that at least 5 of the defendants had prior involvement in disruptions at Texas A&M during a 2016 event featuring white nationalist Richard Spencer. The choreography of the attack, the lures, the timing, the equipment, the shooting forced federal officials to confront a hard truth. A movement once dismissed as symbolic had evolved into something capable of coordinated violence. And if one cell could orchestrate such an operation, how many others might be learning, preparing, or waiting? As the gunfire faded and ambulances raced toward the scene, the question lingered: is America witnessing the rise of a new form of domestic militant organization, one that understands the terrain, exploits technology, and believes it can strike in the shadows? When the smoke cleared at Prairieland, law enforcement faced a stark realization the attack was only the beginning. Within hours, the FBI launched one of the largest domestic manhunts in recent Texas history. Armored vehicles rolled into quiet neighborhoods. Helicopters hovered over fields near Fort Worth. Tactical teams swept through apartment storage units and wooded areas. And as early arrests piled up, it became clear that the Prairieland assault was not an isolated incident. It was a doorway into a far more expansive network. 11 suspects were arrested the night of the attack, but one name triggered widespread alarm across the state: Benjamin Song. According to federal documents, he fled the scene before officers could apprehend him. His escape led to a week-long multi-agency search with blue alerts issued across Texas warning the public that he was armed, trained, and potentially preparing for further violence. Reuters reported that armored vehicles and FBI SWAT units converged on a residential neighborhood in Arlington, startling families as agents conducted flash searches and breaching operations. When Song was finally captured on July 15th, agents recovered multiple firearms connected to the attack evidence, suggesting he was planning to regroup or continue operations. But Song was only one piece of the puzzle. Over the next several weeks, searches tied to other suspects uncovered 14 additional firearms, large quantities of ammunition, ballistic vests, encrypted communication devices, and materials investigators associated with Antifa-linked groups. One defendant, a Dallas schoolteacher, had been arrested 3 separate times in connection to the case. Court records show several suspects with long histories of confrontational activism, including 5 who were detained in 2016 during protests at a Texas A&M event featuring white nationalist Richard Spencer. At this point, the investigation expanded beyond Texas. FBI officials quoted by BBC and The Guardian stated that chats, fund transfers, and document trails linked some suspects to cells in Portland, Los Angeles, and other urban hubs long associated with anti-government activism. In Portland, DW reported a resurgence of courthouse attacks and arson attempts by far-left groups. In California, DHS flagged several individuals traveling between political demonstrations with body armor and encrypted phones. Al Jazeera noted that federal officials were treating these developments as indicators of cross-pollination between previously isolated activist groups. President Donald Trump authorized the use of enhanced domestic terrorism authorities, enabling federal agents to track financial networks, monitor encrypted channels, inspect banking activity, and target anyone suspected of providing material support. According to Defense News, more than 200 FBI agents were reassigned to this single investigation, a level of commitment typically associated with foreign terrorist networks rather than domestic groups. Behind the scenes, analysts debated what these findings meant for national stability. If decentralized cells were communicating, sharing tactics, and coordinating across states, could the United States be witnessing the early architecture of a broader insurgent movement? Or were these just scattered extremists magnified by political tensions? Reuters analysts warned that internal fragmentation of this scale could weaken America's international posture at a moment when rival powers, China, Russia, Iran, were closely monitoring U.S. domestic fractures. For residents of North Texas, the crisis had already arrived. Parents kept children indoors as armored vehicles filled their streets. Local police departments increased patrols around government buildings, and communities long untouched by political violence suddenly found themselves at the center of a national security investigation. If one operation could trigger a nationwide sweep, what might happen if similar cells decide to act in concert, and how far will the government go to stop them before the next shot is fired? The Prairieland attack did more than trigger arrests. It ignited a legal and political battle that now stretches from federal courtrooms to the national stage. Under President Donald Trump, the Justice Department invoked domestic terrorism authorities once used almost exclusively against foreign networks like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. For the first time, prosecutors charged members of an Antifa-linked cell with providing material support to terrorism, attempted murder of federal officers, and discharging firearms during a violent crime. The question emerged instantly across the nation: can a loosely connected movement be prosecuted as a militant enterprise? Federal prosecutors say yes. In their indictment, they describe Antifa not as a protest banner or vague ideology, but as a militant enterprise, a decentralized network of individuals and microcells sharing tactics, gear, encrypted communications, and an explicit commitment to confronting the US government. According to BBC legal analysts, the language marks a dramatic shift in how domestic political violence is framed, and it sets a precedent that could redefine the boundary between activism and terrorism. Key defendants Cameron Arnold and Zachary Evitz face the most severe charges. Prosecutors argue that Arnold manufactured AR platform rifles for the group, while Evitz coordinated logistics through encrypted apps. Reuters noted that these charges mirror those used in high-level counterterrorism cases, allowing investigators to pursue supporters, financiers, and facilitators with the same tools used against overseas extremist networks. Defense attorneys responded fiercely. They argued that Antifa is not an organization, has no leaders, no membership lists, and no verified structure, and thus cannot be treated like a terror group. According to the Guardian defense teams, insist the government is criminalizing dissent, framing anti-government rhetoric as evidence of violent conspiracy. They argue that radical speech is not a crime, and that encrypted messages reflect privacy concerns, not militant planning. But the Trump administration sees it differently. Kash Patel, a senior figure in national security policy, stated that the government is now empowered to pursue financial networks, transportation support, encrypted communication hubs, and any individual providing material support, an umbrella term that historically allowed prosecutors to dismantle extremist networks piece by piece. Patel emphasized that even during the government shutdown, the president ensured full funding for more than 12,000 FBI agents involved in these investigations. DW analysts highlighted a striking strategic shift. Federal agencies are now treating left-wing violence as a national security priority, not merely a public order issue. Meanwhile, Al Jazeera noted concerns among civil liberties advocates that broad terrorism statutes could be applied unevenly, depending on the political winds of Washington. Yet the global context casts an even longer shadow. Defense News reported that foreign governments, including China and Russia, closely monitor America's domestic instability, viewing internal fractures as strategic opportunities. Every clash, every arrest, every courtroom battle becomes part of a larger struggle over US credibility and control. And the stakes continue to climb. As the Justice Department prepares its landmark case, America faces a crossroads. Will the assertion of expanded federal power restore stability, or will aggressive prosecution deepen the ideological divide? If the government can label a decentralized protest movement as a militant enterprise today, what other groups left, right, or independent might face the same treatment tomorrow? As autumn settles over the country, the Prairieland case now moves toward a moment that could redefine America's domestic security landscape for decades. On November 24th, a federal jury will hear the first ever terrorism trial involving individuals prosecutors describe as part of an Antifa militant cell. The stakes could not be higher. If the government succeeds, it will solidify a legal pathway, allowing authorities to treat decentralized ideological networks as terror enterprises. If it fails, a new wave of questions will erupt about the limits of federal power, the fragility of civil liberties, and the boundaries of political dissent in the United States. Federal officials warn that this trial is not about one night in Texas. It is a test case one that will influence how law enforcement responds to domestic political violence nationwide. According to Reuters, left-wing violence outpaced right-wing violence in 2025 for the first time in 3 decades, intensifying pressure on authorities to act decisively. Jane's analysts note that the tools now deployed against Antifa-linked groups, financial tracing, encrypted data recovery, cross-state surveillance mirror those once used against foreign insurgent movements. For America's allies, particularly in Europe, this signals a dramatic evolution in how the US manages internal security threats. But the implications reach far beyond law enforcement. Civil rights groups fear the erosion of free speech protections. Constitutional scholars interviewed by BBC warn that labeling an amorphous movement as a terror network risks criminalizing ideologies rather than actions. Meanwhile, The Guardian reports that younger activists already distrustful of institutions view the Prairieland prosecutions as proof of expanding state power, potentially radicalizing a new generation rather than deterring violence. This is the fragile balance: security versus liberty, stability versus resistance. On the global stage, America's adversaries have taken notice. Al Jazeera highlights that both Russia and China frame US domestic unrest as evidence of declining American cohesion. DW reports that European intelligence services quietly worry about the precedent if the US champion of free expression begins prosecuting right-wing political movements, as terrorist other nations may follow some with far more authoritarian consequences. In North Texas, the human scars remain visible. The police lieutenant wounded in the neck now faces a long recovery. Families near the detention center still remember the armored vehicles that roared down their streets. And communities once distant from political extremism now find themselves at the epicenter of a national debate. To them, the trial is more than a legal proceeding. It is a question of safety, identity, and the future of public order. As the nation waits for the verdict, one truth stands clear. The Prairieland case has opened a new chapter in America's struggle with domestic extremism. This is no longer a clash of protests and slogans. It is a battle over how the country defines itself, how it confronts internal threats, and how far the government is willing to go in the name of security. When the jury announces its decision, will the nation feel safer, or will the ruling deepen the divides that brought the country to this moment? The Prairieland attack in North Texas marked a turning point in America's confrontation with domestic extremism. On July 4th, a coordinated assault on an ICE detention center left a police lieutenant wounded and triggered a massive federal manhunt. Prosecutors say the attackers belonged to a decentralized ANTIFA-linked cell equipped with military-style gear, encrypted communications, and rifles allegedly manufactured by one of the defendants. Over 20 arrests followed, uncovering wider networks stretching into cities like Portland and Los Angeles. Under President Donald Trump, the Justice Department invoked terrorism statutes once reserved for foreign threats, framing Antifa as a militant enterprise. Civil rights groups warned that this approach risks broadening federal power in ways that could endanger free expression. As the first terrorism trial begins on November 24th, the nation faces a critical test whether decentralized ideological groups can be treated as terror networks. The outcome will shape future counter-extremism policy, influence America's global image, and determine how the country balances security with liberty. The Prairieland case is more than a prosecution. It is a defining moment for America's domestic stability and democratic resilience.